Hi all, thanks for joining us today. My name's Adithya. I work with the Center for Policy Design at A3 and also with the Ecological Restoration Alliance. And for those who don't know, the Ecological Restoration Alliance is a network of researchers and practitioners and civil society organizations working on restoration and broadly working to support community-led and evidence-based restoration practices in India. And the Alliance works through a set of desks that address different aspects of the work related to restoration. So A3 houses the policy desk for the ERA. And the aim of the policy desk is to conduct restoration-related research, policy research, policy analysis, and government engagement broadly. And the hope is that we can make links between restoration science, practice, and policy, and eventually sort of inform restoration-related, state-led restoration practice in India. So today's talk will address some of these things, particularly how policies come to shape ecosystems in India, as well as the lives of people who are dependent on these ecosystems. It focuses on a set of landscapes that are often overlooked called open natural ecosystems. And they include grasslands, scrublands, savannas, and drylands that are often misclassified, poorly protected, and increasingly threatened by land use changes and misguided restoration efforts. Our speaker today is Dr. Abi Vanak. He's the director for the Center for Policy Design at A3 and is a conservation biologist and ecologist. He works at the intersection of biodiversity, pastoralism, and land use. And he has also played a key role in advocating for the recognition and protection of grasslands in India, as well as other open natural ecosystems. With that, I'll hand it over to Abi to start with the presentation. If there are questions, we can take it up at the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Abi, you want to share your screen right now?
All right, so thanks Adithya, and thanks to the ERA for inviting me for this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to all of you about a topic that's really close to my heart and something I've been working on for better part of the last 15 to 20 years. So we're going to talk beyond forests today and rethink restoration and conservation and policy around India's open natural ecosystems. I'm Abi Vanak. I'm the director for the Center for Policy Design at A3. So broadly, I hope to cover in this presentation ONEs, or open natural ecosystems, that the definition, threats, policy issues, the importance of these ONEs for livelihoods, biodiversity, and climate. And also sort of end on some examples of restoration that we've been carrying out and hope to inspire others to take up this cause as well. So, open natural ecosystems are very broadly framed by water. So precipitation is one of the key drivers of what an open natural ecosystem should look like. So at the very arid end, it can be really open, grassy, or even desert-like. But as rainfall increases, then you start coming into what's called the savanna zone, especially, and this is particularly true for tropical areas, where you have a mix of trees and grass. And the classical definition of a savanna is that it's a mixed tree grass system with a discontinuous tree canopy and a continuous grass layer. So the ratio of trees to grasses really depends on how much rainfall occurs at that given place. The lower the rainfall, the fewer the trees there are. The more the rainfall, the more trees there are, until it reaches a certain cap. The upper end of the rainfall sort of spectrum is really the tree density starts looking almost what you would call forest-like. But there are a couple of other factors that will also determine what drives this tree-grass balance in savannas and other ONEs. And that's fire and herbivory and soil nutrients. So even at the upper end of what you should get, where you should see a lot of trees, things like herbivory will come and drive the tree density down. Fire, of course, is also called a global herbivore, and that affects both the grass layer as well as tree layers. So in a lot of savannas and what we call dry forests, trees tend to be fire adapted. So all the woody vegetation also tends to be fire adapted, because fire is a natural part of this process, of the cycle or seasonal cycle of these landscapes. And as you look at this continuum, you can then see that on the lower end you'll end up having mostly grasslands with very few trees or no trees on lower end of the rainfall spectrum. But as you start moving to wetter landscapes, you have this middle zone, and this middle zone is what I want to sort of want you to concentrate a little bit. This is the zone where, just move this out of the way. So this zone is between 200 to about 800 mm of rainfall, which is where you'll see these classic savanna landscapes. And above that, anything above that, between 800 to 1200 mm rainfall, you start seeing more forest-like systems, which are then where tree cover is then suppressed by fire or herbivory. So what do these zones look like in India? Where are they? Where are these arid and semi-arid regions of India? Well, obviously you've got the very arid parts of the Great Thar Desert in Western India, Gujarat and Rajasthan, moving on into parts of Haryana and Western Punjab. But a lot of peninsular India, all the way down from down south in Tamil Nadu, all the way through central India, the Deccan Plateau, all of this falls in that semi-arid belt. And so this is where obviously you'll expect to see savannas in India as well. But if you look at a vegetation map of India, pick almost any traditional vegetation map of India, and the thing you will notice, so look at the names of all of these vegetation types in the legend here on the right, and you'll see woodlands, forests, some salt marsh, some terai duar, savanna and grassland. But nowhere else do you see in the central arid zone or in the western arid zone and the central semi-arid zone the word savanna showing up, even though these are climatically within the savanna zone. So instead you have something called the Deccan thorn scrub forest, or the Kathiar Gir dry deciduous forest, or the or you have the Chota Nagpur dry deciduous forest, and so on, and of course the Thar Desert. But the word savanna seems to be missing, even though if you look at a map of tropical savannas across the world, and you looked at that bioclimatic envelope that you find in this region, you will find that India is very much in the same bioclimatic zone as the world savannas. What we know, whether it's in the African continent and even beyond, in Australia, as well as in South America and in other places, the same bioclimatic envelope that you would call a savanna or grassland elsewhere exists in India, and yet we don't classify Indian savannas as savannas, and instead we call them forests. So one of the things that I've been working on for a very long time is try to map these grasslands and open natural ecosystems of India, and working with colleagues MD Madhusudan and Pradeep Kulgi, we've now come out with this high resolution map of ONEs, or what we call open natural ecosystems. Now, what did we define as open natural ecosystems? Basically anything that's not naturally forested in the traditional definition. So that would include then deserts and sand dunes, savanna grasslands, rocky outcrops, and even open forests. So as I said, Mesic savannas, which have normally been classified as forests, now get classified or reclassified as open natural ecosystems. And in some cases, they might also include sparsely vegetated geological features such as the ravines of the Chambal, for instance, or the fairly barren looking laterite plateaus of the Western Ghats. So all of these are naturally open, naturally treeless. And so now there's a map that shows you where these landscapes are, and it's available at fairly high resolution. Of course, more refining is going on, and this is a continuous process. But it's available for download. This map is free, and the data are available for open as open access. So anyone wants to play around with this data set, write to me, and you can get access to it. What do these landscapes look like on the ground? Well, they're stunning. They're as stunning as any other grassland or savanna that you'd see anywhere else in the world. Whether it's the savannas of Dhavalpuri in Ahmednagar, or the vast open grasslands of Banni, which unfortunately have fairly high prosopis infestation, or other grasslands in Maharashtra, and in Karnataka you also have the stunning rock outcrops of Hampi, which are a part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there's a fair diversity of all of these, from savanna woodlands to ravines to scrub savannas, grasslands, dunes, and so on. So it's quite a rich story that our open natural ecosystems tell. Other than that, we also have non-semi-arid ones, so the ones which are in the wetter regions, ones that are formed by either the action of floods or altitude and temperature. So for example, the famous Terai Duar grasslands stretching from Assam in the east all the way along the Himalayan foothills all the way to erstwhile national capital territory, but Uttarakhand and so on. Then you have the high altitude pasture lands in the Himalayas and their counterparts in the Western Ghats, the famous Shola grasslands. So there's quite a stunning diversity. And along with this diversity of grasslands and open ecosystems, there's also a diversity of plants. And these plants are endemic and found, endemic means they're found nowhere else. And these old growth savannas have very high native grassland species here. And they're very distinct. These communities are distinct. So this really excellent paper by Ashish Nerlekar and colleagues showed that old growth savannas in central India had very high levels of endemism, but when you converted these into tree plantations or plowed them up in any way or disturbed them, then the species communities shifted and the species diversity reduced quite drastically. Other than that, we also have a whole host of other mammal, bird, and insect and reptilian diversity here. Many of these are actually quite endangered, critically endangered even, such as the great Indian bustard and the lesser florican. There are many others which are on the verge of being, they are certainly endangered. We could also classify them, or they could be reclassified as critically endangered if we continue the destruction of savannas as we currently do. So this is what a description of our savannas and their landscape looks like. Okay, but where are the hotspots of savanna endemism? So we took that map that we had, the open natural ecosystem map of India, and then we started looking at diversity. We started looking at distributions of key faunal species that are unique to these savanna landscapes. And then we started prioritizing them. Now, if you look at this map, this is a national level map, but there are also state level priority maps, which look slightly different because the species that are found in each state will then determine what is the top priority for that state. So then you start seeing which areas have really high priority. And clearly, Western India is of really high priority for the protection of open ONE species. All these green blobs that you see here are the protected area network of India. And you'll also see for the most part that they exclude these high priority areas for conservation. So clearly there's a gap. There's a big gap in what we want to protect and where we can protect them. So traditionally in the Indian context, open ecosystem species have been left out of the ambit of the Wildlife Protection Act. And so therefore you're seeing the greatest declines. So for example, the state of India's birds report, the latest one, shows that grassland birds have declined the most. And and you can see why from maps such as this, because we were never our conservation paradigm was never designed to protect open ecosystem species, and especially landscape level species. Instead, we focused a lot on forest patches. These landscapes are also important from the perspective of carbon sequestration, and this is something that we've been highlighting more and more. This is an illustration of an IPCC report where we showed the potential for carbon sequestration in different types of landscapes or biomes is described. And you can see that this area here is tropical forests, is where most of our attention goes, especially in India. And we want to plant trees. Clearly trees are important. And above ground carbon, which is what you are targeting through tree plantation, reaches a certain level in tropical forests, about 120 tons of carbon per hectare. But what you see is that below ground is an equivalent amount as well. Now, if you shift your gaze down just a little bit into that box that I put here, you can see that tropical savannas, which is what most of these ONEs are, and deserts and semi-deserts, also sequester carbon. Obviously, the amount of above ground carbon in these landscapes will be low because it's too dry to grow trees. But below ground carbon in these landscapes is almost equivalent, especially in the savannas, is almost equivalent to that of forest landscapes. But it occurs at a far lower rainfall rate. So they're sequestering similar amounts of carbon below ground, but requiring far less water to do it. And this carbon, below ground carbon, as most carbon people will tell you, is quite stable. It's not prone to vanishing. Say, for example, if there's a forest fire, all of the above, in a tree, you lose lots of the carbon, above ground carbon, or due to deforestation or due to pest attacks. But below ground carbon tends to get disturbed only if you disturb the soil. So it's really important for carbon sequestration, and this is something we want to generate greater evidence from the Indian context. So what does that look like from the Indian context? So we're doing some of these studies now, and we're finding that if most of our savannas are disturbed and degraded, which means that they have fairly low soil carbon levels. But if you start restoring them, then very quickly their carbon stores start going up. So in a paper we published last year or 2 years ago now, we found that soil carbon stores can go up fairly rapidly within even just a short period of 3 years in the soil, okay, because of restoration of grass. But if you compare it to an undisturbed old growth grassland, you still have a greater potential for soil carbon storage. Okay, so there is a fairly huge potential for us to use our open ecosystems to meet our carbon sequestration goals, our nationally determined contributions, and meet our land degradation neutrality targets. In a paper that we just published, my colleagues Banni and a few others, we showed that places such as the Banni grasslands store whopping amounts of carbon below ground, almost equivalent to actually more than some of those forest areas that we compared it to. And it occurs in semi-arid landscapes. So it's, Banni gets between 200 to 300 mm of rainfall. So it's almost on the arid end of the rainfall regime. So these areas are critically important. And we also showed that carbon sequestration was actually low, or soil carbon sequestration was actually lower under prosopis than it was under restored grasslands. So again, you can't plant your way out of this mess. It's not just from the biodiversity and climate perspective that grasslands are important. The livelihoods of 1.3 crore pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists from over 46 communities are dependent on these open ecosystems, these grasslands, for their livelihoods. And this is huge the economic value of extensive pastoralism in India is only just being estimated, and colleagues from Center for Pastoralism are driving some of this. And we can see that there is a huge economy revolving around this. So 53% of our milk and about 74% of our meat comes from open ecosystem or extensive livestock grazing. And remember that this is a low cost and low input livelihood that produces this value. Similarly, the value of the organic fertilizer that comes from India's sheep alone is valued at 1,468 crores annually. Similarly, other pastoralist derived income is about 3,000 crores. So if you put that together, it's about 1.31 lakh crores annually. So that's a massive contribution to our agriculture economy, and this more or less goes unaccounted for, and therefore the value of these open ecosystems gets diminished. As a result of which, our grasslands are really under threat. They're under threat from a variety of factors. The number one, of course, being intensive agriculture. So as the demand for land for agriculture increases and for productivity increases, more and more areas being brought under irrigated agriculture. So once that happens, then most people start switching to cash crops or start growing multiple crops a year. And that pushes out some of the traditional pastoralists into ever smaller and smaller shrinking parcels of land, which then obviously leads to degradation of those remaining landscapes from overgrazing. Other factors are our large push for renewable energy. So that's taking up hundreds of square kilometers of landscape, especially in the Thar Desert, but all across India. And we need to look for suitable and sustainable alternatives to mitigating some of these, because obviously renewable energy is important, but we need to also prioritize where we can deploy renewable energy so that it doesn't have negative outcomes on grasslands. For years also, we've been treating grasslands as blanks and been planting trees on them because we assumed that they were degraded forests. This, of course, we know now not to be true. And there's been a lot of efforts to afforest these landscapes. In addition to that, we've also not understood the role of fire when it comes to to our savannas, and therefore fires have become uncontrolled. In that, fires are important for savannas, but now fire regimes have become altered, and so many of them burn too often. And if they burn too often, it can cause degradation. The last one, of course, is invasive species, and we do have a very severe problem with invasive species in open ecosystems, whether it's Prosopis juliflora, whether it's lantana, whether it's hyptis, and many others. They can very rapidly take over our grasslands and make them unproductive. So, there are clearly multiple contestations over a lot of this land use, and all of this comes down to policy. Which is a key driver of all of this land use change. Okay, so an example of this kind of policy is that for example, green projects, windmills, solar parks are exempt from EI in India, from the environmental impact assessment process, and so therefore, if they are deployed in open ecosystems which are not declared as which legally have not been declared as forests, they don't require any environmental impact. The government gives them a green light and they can go ahead and do whatever they want. So then it results in the destruction of a lot of these really important habitats that we are concerned with. Things such as the wasteland, the policies and documents from the government, such as the Wastelands Atlas of India, don't help. India tends to classify based on a very unfortunate colonial legacy, where the British had looked at these areas as unproductive and therefore had classified them as wastelands. So more than 557,000 square kilometers of India has been classified as wasteland by government agencies, and we need to try and change this policy in particular. Thankfully, we've been told that the wasteland atlas is no longer being produced, but the term wasteland is still used under revenue records. So whenever any development needs to happen, then the first land use that gets converted or target for conversion are wastelands. So this is something that we need to work on. And as you can see from this table, land with dense scrub and land with open scrub tend to be the ones which are the most commonly described wastelands. If you go back to what the original wasteland policy was about, though, it wasn't about land conversion. It was about land degradation. It was about saying wasteland is a degraded land which can be brought under vegetative cover with reasonable effort, and which is currently underutilized, and land which is deteriorating for lack of appropriate water and soil management. So if you go back to the original mandate of the Wastelands Development Board, then it was actually to restore some of these areas and not to convert them into other uses. So this is something that we want to push for now in terms of policy. Okay, and so we looked at who governs grasslands and other open natural ecosystems in India, and we found that it's actually it's everybody, and it's unfortunately nobody. So some parts of some schemes of various departments, multiple ministries, at the central level, at the state level, several different bodies, constitutional bodies and institutions, all have some stake in how these areas are governed or how the schemes run through them. But none of them have responsibility to maintain them as grasslands. So even areas that are designated as pastoral lands, for instance, or grazing commons, tend to get used for other purposes, and this is sanctioned by the government. So unlike forest lands, which which at least on paper have fairly strong legal mechanism of protection, the non-forest lands, the open ecosystems, almost completely lack these. So we want to try and see how these different schemes can influence this. So what we did was we ranked it, and we found that these policy tools have a lot of impact on our open natural ecosystems. And again, you don't have to go through the details of these slides, but so for example, one of the most common things that's done in ONEs is soil and water conservation. And unfortunately, most of the soil and water conservation work actually tends to disturb these ONEs. So it's soil disturbing. They usually tend to dig trenches and bunds and do gully plugging and this, that, and the other, which tends to disturb soil. There are very few nature-based solutions, such as restoring the grasslands, to prevent soil erosion that happen in these places. So this is something, again, that we are working on to bring about a change in policy. And one way we're doing this is to give examples of how grasslands and savannas can be restored. And we're doing it through what we're calling community-centric ecological restoration methods. So this obviously involves co-learning with the relevant stakeholders, understanding what their needs are, bringing them on board, or often taking their lead in realizing the need for what types of grasslands need to be restored, and restored for what. So most of their requirements are for fodder production. So we want to prioritize the restoration to native fodder species in many of these landscapes, so that local livelihoods can be maintained in these landscapes. And monitoring and evaluation of the interventions, protocols, etc. is critically important for all of these places. And it's a complex challenge, because the idea of grassland improvement itself is based, and it goes back to colonial forestry, but also comes from the idea that the landscapes of India are naturally forested, and that a grassland is therefore a human-created product, or a human-created landscape, that they are formed via forest degradation. But the ecological and evolutionary history of India's grasslands make it amply clear to us that these are in fact old growth, they're ancient, and they are productive ecosystems that don't necessarily need to be improved through growing trees on them, but certainly can be restored so that their ecosystem functions are fully restored. Okay. to be wrong here. Okay, so there's a bouquet of interventions one can carry out. There's a lot of baseline surveying that needs to be done. We do soil sample collection to test for soil carbon and other soil parameters. We are testing to see what kinds of fire and grazing interventions work best for grasslands in a particular area. And then we are starting nurseries using the help of local self-help groups. We're doing a lot of workshops and sensitizing various government departments as well as other stakeholders. And finally, we are doing a lot of on-ground activity to restore some of these landscapes by planting them with grasses. And all of this, of course, requires documentation. So making sure that monitoring and evaluation of all of this is really important. We have adopted something called the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework, LDSF. It's developed by ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Institute. And this framework is part of a global monitoring framework. So whatever data we collect can be matched or can be compared to what's happening globally. And we are also very importantly including traditional knowledge. So we are talking to local communities, especially the pastoralist communities, about the mix of grasses and herbs and forbs that are found in these landscapes. And when we are, when we prepare our planting material, we're also asking them to go and scatter them in their grazing routes so that some of these landscapes can be revived. And so there's a whole bunch of projects that we have got ongoing. We've got one in Karnataka, we've got one in Rajasthan, several of them in Maharashtra. So all of these landscapes all of these examples are teaching us how to do this properly. So in some places we are propagating through root slips, some places we are growing saplings in the nursery, in many places we are using seed dispersal, and in some places we're working on forest land. So using landscapes that the forest department had done some work on, usually for tree plantation, but now bringing in grasses back into those areas. So it's a whole bouquet of interventions depending on what the site is. And also we're working with village institutions, so different tenure regimes, to understand what are the challenges of working with each of those. And this is hopefully going to give us in the next couple of years a real good idea of what works where and what doesn't work also, and what's the feasibility of doing this at scale across India. This is an example of one of our nurseries. This is one of the largest nurseries we have for grasses. It can, with a capacity of about 4.5 lakh saplings that can be produced here of several species of grasses. And most of these are, because the demand is for fodder, so we're mostly propagating fodder grasses, which are all native grasses here, which are suitable to that region. So for example, our mix of grasses in the nursery is different different in Rajasthan than it is from Maharashtra, for instance, and similarly for Karnataka, although some species might overlap. Okay. And what we find that grasslands, unlike forest ecosystems where you might take a decade or a lot more to see some impact, in a very short period of time, just within a year or two, you can see really good revival of these landscapes. And you can go from an area that looks fairly degraded, heavily overgrazed, to having fairly good biomass, just with very little, with some intervention, some invasive species removal, some seeding, or some slip or sapling plantation, and you see revival of those grasslands. Our idea is not to, what we do is we don't want to exclude them from grazing. Instead, we want to try and say restrict grazing just for the first six months to 1 year, so that the saplings have established and have gone through the first flowering cycle. That's all we really are looking for, so that from second year onwards, they're established, the rootstock is established, so they can grazing can be resumed. But we advocate for rotational grazing to give some rest to some of these places. So this, I'm going to leave you here with this. I think I've covered about 40 minutes of the talk. or 30 minutes of the talk. So I will end here, and I believe there are a bunch of questions, and so I'm happy to take questions from the audience if there are any. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so we can move on to the Q&A. I think there are already 3 questions that have come in the chat. We can take those first, and if anybody who just wants to unmute and ask a question, that'll also be great. So the first question is from Anand. He asks, how does fire ecology play a role in maintaining the health of open ecosystems?
That's a great question, Anand. And as I mentioned in my, earlier on, that fire plays several roles in that ecosystem, in an open ecosystem. It can obviously suppress growth of woody vegetation. So at the more mesic end, fire will open up the landscape, prevent a forest-like state from coming up, and therefore grasses can grow in the understory. But repeated fire, especially if you have fire happening every year, that can then convert the species composition or change species composition, and actually result in lower diversity of species in some places to mostly fire-resistant species. And also more unpalatable species, and also change the composition between perennial and annual grasses that you'd find here. So you want to have sort of like a Goldilocks zone of fire return intervals, maybe around 3 to 5 years in most landscapes, but that needs to be tested from the Indian context a little bit more. So to some, fire is really important. It's an important part of the ecology of open ecosystems. And suppressing fire is bad, and too much fire is also bad. So you need to have the right sort of frequency of fire and the temperature of fire in these landscapes.
Yeah, we've got another anonymous question. It's a bit general. It says, could you please explain some of the best practices which can be used for grassland restoration in India? Maybe some broad points.
Yeah, so some of the best. So the easiest thing to do is relieve some of the pressure that you might have on grasslands, especially if there's very high grazing pressure, and allow for natural regeneration to take place. But where the grasslands have become very dominated by 1 or 2 species, then it might take some intervention for you. So you could try seeding with a mix of species, but what we found is that seedling or germination rates can be fairly poor. So if you want to kickstart the process, then obtain slips or get saplings of grasses from nurseries, or try and establish them on your own, and use that to bring some of those species back into the landscape again. But generally, if you restrict grazing, and I'm saying restrict and not remove, because there is a period where grazing can have. So the flowering period is the most important. So post monsoon, the grasses need to grow up, flower, set seed. So that if you can prevent grazing for those 1 or 2 months, and then open it up again, that's fine. So that's the critical period that then allows for regeneration of these areas to happen. So that's typically what we should try and focus
on. Yeah. Next question is, do you think pastoral practices and livestock mobility are still central to restoration and long-term management of grasslands, or is this perception changing over time?
So, the pastoralist practices and mobility really has been the key to the use of these landscapes, which see a lot of variation in productivity over the season. So pastoralists, have been because these are semi-arid landscapes, they do something called surfing the green wave, where they come in with the monsoons, and their livestock utilize that first flush of green, and then they keep moving, so they're never overgrazing any one area. Typically, this used to be the system. Obviously, over time, with grasslands shrinking, the pastoral lands available for them have also reduced, and therefore the pressure on any one area has also increased. So this is something that requires policy to change so that we can allow for pastoral lands to be restored in some areas, accessibility to be increased, and some of these practices brought back. Because let's remember that pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism in particular, is a climate resilient and adaptive form of livelihood. And we are chasing all sorts of other means of livelihoods, whereas here we have one which is low carbon. These folks live really low carbon lifestyles. They're always in the move. They often carry all their belongings with them. Their livestock have a low impact. So instead, we are trying to sedentarize them, bring them into agriculture, trying to get them to grow fodder for their livestock. So we're actually taking something that really works, and we're trying to divert it into something that may not work and actually make them more susceptible. Because as we know, rainfall and all other climatic patterns have really, really shifted and have become very erratic. So it's important for us to now incentivize this kind of livelihood as well, with the correct sort of economic benefits or economic models that can really bring about a change for better in their lives.
Yeah. The next question is from Siddhak. What allows grasslands to have such a high underground carbon storage capacity?
So basically, their root network is fairly deep. So most perennial grasses are very old. Each individual clump can be tens of years old. And so their root networks can be pretty deep, and that's what's drawing all this carbon into the soil. And of course, there's microbial activity going on, but because it's also semi-arid and it's fairly dry, that carbon tends to stay there. It's stable. It doesn't degrade or decompose and go back up into the air. So that's what allows grasslands to sequester or have good carbon stocks, despite having low rainfall areas. Obviously, in forests you have higher rainfall, so there's more growth happening there. So that means there's also more turnover of carbon. But a lot of carbon gets stored above ground in trees, and the tree roots also store a lot of carbon below ground. So, but that comes at a higher rainfall rate.
Yeah. The next question is just asking if you have any thoughts about the introduction of cheetahs in Banni, and if you can also talk a little bit about grasslands in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I do have thoughts. I think, look, the idea of having cheetahs in any landscape in India requires us to think about what kind of species what is the consequence of that. Cheetahs used to occur here once, and they've been brought back now. We can debate about whether the Asian cheetahs, African cheetahs, that's fine, whatever. But the fact is that they've been brought back. Some of them are free ranging. The question to really ask, though, is that if you want to have a population of free ranging cheetahs in India, then where's the habitat going to be? It's not just Banni, it could be anywhere else, Madhya Pradesh also. So we need to take a long-term view of identifying the grassland habitats. Currently what's happening is we are still focusing on individual patches. So we are focusing on protected areas, for instance. So, Kuno National Park or Kaila Devi or, any of the other national parks. That thinking has to go away, because grasslands are spread all across India, all across these peninsular India. And species such as cheetah, or for that matter, let's talk about native species also, or the ones that are already here. The Indian wolf, the great Indian bustard, lesser florican, they're all grassland species, and they're also landscape species, which means they require huge areas. Okay, so they don't get restricted to protected areas. Our protected areas for the most part are postage stamp size, 2,000 or 1,000 square kilometers at the most. Banni is large, but a lot of it gets flooded. So it doesn't matter if you introduce a few cheetahs into Banni. What matters is what's happening to the surrounding landscape. Okay, and if you're going to keep losing grasslands in the surrounding landscape at a rapid pace, then all you're doing is creating islands, and then there's no future for any species there. Forget cheetahs. It could be wolves, it could be blackbuck, it could be chinkara, it could be the great Indian bustard. So we really do need to think of a landscape approach to conservation and not just our fortress protected area approach.
Yeah, there was also a
A
follow-up
question
question.
about Tamil Nadu, yeah. So, southern Tamil Nadu has some really nice grasslands. So, grasslands in Tamil Nadu and a few other states occur both low elevation as well as high elevation. I know most of my talk will talk about low elevation grasslands, which is the semi-arid tract, but we also have the Shola grasslands in the Nilgiris. It's the low elevation grasslands that tend to be the most degraded or the most endangered. Tamil Nadu has some really unique open ecosystems. You have the borassus flabellifer dominated savannas in the south. You also have the red sand dunes. Really interesting geological features there. So Tamil Nadu, also southern Tamil Nadu, has some really nice grasslands and savannas there.
Yeah, we can't see your question though. I hope you've typed it later on, so we're going to
There's a
ignore
lot
this
of
one for now.
questions.
The
45 questions. I don't think we're going to have time to answer all 45, but
yeah,
let's do the best.
I think we've already answered the next one as well, which is about below ground carbon. Okay, so which actors are involved in restoration projects and what are their respective priorities? What are the major sources of funding for restoration projects? Does this influence project goals and what gets implemented on the ground?
Yeah. So the government is the largest funder of restoration projects. And this comes under what's called natural resource management. And you'll be surprised to know that Manrega is the largest source of funds for land management in India. A lot of Manrega works are what called NRM works. So NRM is basically natural resource management, which it could include soil and water conservation. It could include bunding. It could include digging ponds for water percolation or for whatever it is. So these are also some forms of restoration. The forest department and Campa and so on are also large sources of funds for restoration. So the government, in the government, those are the largest sources of funds for restoration. A lot of it is tree based. So it's plantation based, is to increase green cover. And by green cover, we mainly talk about trees. But the places where tree cover is sought to be increased tend to be open ecosystems. So not necessarily where trees should grow or do grow or have historically grown. And therefore, a lot of that money also gets wasted because those trees never grow or never grow to their optimal condition that you would expect. So even after 40 or 50 years, most of these plantations have failed and they don't look very healthy because either the wrong species of trees were grown or the fact that trees were grown in savannas means that they'll never grow. So you can plant them at rainforest densities, but you'll only have some scattering of trees grown there. So those are the challenges, and that's the perspective that most restoration folks come from in India, because restoration is seen as synonymous with plantation of trees, and this is a problem because you actually end up then causing degradation to an existing landscape itself. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind. Other sources of funding include philanthropy, CSR, and of course, individual action. And for all of these, we urge socio-ecologically responsible restoration, not just blind tree planting campaigns.
How do you figure out how to germinate grasses? What were your challenges?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We've faced lots of challenges in trying to figure out what mix of species to use for our grassland projects. In many cases, we found that for clump forming grasses, it's better to get root slips from existing patches. So then you'll have to either go find places where they're grown from a nursery or maybe on a farmer's land or somewhere, and then segregate them into individual slips and propagate them on a bed or in a nursery. So that works. Some species germinate only after a long time. So just preparing seed balls and throwing it out there is not going to result in any immediate gains. You have to understand the cycle that those seeds take before they can germinate. So these are all experiments that are ongoing, and we are going to we are trying to come up with sort of a list of best practices that can help people best choose what method to use in their landscape.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, biggest challenges, is sourcing materials. There's almost no grass nurseries in India. Getting seeds is difficult. Sourcing plantation materials is difficult. So we had to spend a lot of money just setting all of that up.
Utsav asks, are there species distribution maps of key fauna of ONEs? Are they open source? And do we have data on fire history of ONEs?
The species distribution maps are they are open source. You can you can just write to us and you could request them from us. We haven't put them up on a portal or anything, but they're available on a report that we've made. It's called it's a white paper on open natural ecosystems. You can download it from the CPD website at ATRI. But if you'd like to have, if you want to have access to the individual species maps, we're happy to share them with you. We don't, in terms of fire history, we can get the fire history from satellite data, but otherwise, there's no other records as such because nobody has really been mapping ONEs. So, but you can get once you have an ONE mapped, you can then go back in time and look at the fire scars based on Aster satellite data.
Vijay asks, given that the rocky landscapes have been taken over by neem, hectis, lantana, and others, how are these landscapes to be restored?
So I think probably the best example of this is from Rajasthan, where the Rao Jodha Park folks, and maybe you can get in touch with Pradeep, Kishan, and or just others from the ERA. They'll point you in the right direction. They've done a lot of work to try and restore these landscapes in the this thing. In these rocky outcrops in the desert, especially around the Jaisalmer landscape.
Yeah, the next question, it's not a question. Dr. Kirti from the government of AP says she's working on AP.
Yeah, I've read that, so we can share our email. You can look online for our email address, and happy to connect with you, and I'm sure she can connect with the RA as well.
Yeah. The next question is, how is below ground carbon measured and can they generate carbon credits?
So it's measured using soil analysis. So you take a core sample, you can read one of our papers and see what the methods are, but these are all standard methodology. They have not yet been used for generating carbon credits, but that's something that we are working on to try and understand how it can be done. And we're hoping that if this is done, then it will really give a boost to people for maintaining their grasslands, especially in private areas.
Yeah, the next question is, have you already had discussions with some government agencies managing these areas about their land management practices with regards to ONEs? It'll be nice to hear their broad comments, concerns, and how receptive they were of your insights.
Yeah, we've been talking to a lot of government agencies, both at the central level and at the state level, and mostly the interactions are positive. A lot of them realize that the importance of ONEs from multiple perspectives, and so we are hopeful that we'll see some policy change in the right direction in the years going ahead.
Gaurav asks, in shifting cultivation landscapes of Koraput, Orissa, open secondary forests support a wide variety of grassland species. However, their composition varies as per the duration of land sparing and cultivation regimes. In this context, how do we visualize ONE conservation?
So, that's a really interesting question, Gaurav. And here, what I want to differentiate is we have to ensure that it's not degraded forest that's converted into grassland or a savanna. Because if it originally was a forest and has been, where you've seen shifting cultivation going on, then you're going to find a very different mix of species in these landscapes. How you, in what state you want to keep that, or people want to keep that in, is dependent on local context. But the you know the reason, when Madhu and I were writing that paper, the reason we wanted to call it an open natural ecosystem is because we wanted to also emphasize the natural part of it. So as being separate from open ecosystems that have been created by human intervention, such as through cutting down of forests and creating open landscapes. So that's something that need to be looked at, and it's not always straightforward, because in any landscape you could have a combination of forests, savannas, grasslands. I mean, Panna National Park is a great example of that. As you go from the escarpment to the plateau, you'll find 3 different vegetation types. So it all depends on local geology, rainfall regimes, and so local conditions do determine what types of vegetation you get in all of those places.
Yeah, Sagnik asks, Dr. Ahmed, thank you for the informative talk. Wondering if there are any remote sensing based validation studies for treatment versus control sites of assisted natural regeneration, such as changes in NDVI.
Look, there can be, but the scale has to be big enough to be captured by a remote sensing sensor. So obviously now there's very high resolution sensors, so you should be able to generate changes in NDVI. But those kinds of things work best at very large landscapes. So your ANR has to happen over a very large area. If it's smaller areas, then it's best to just do it manually, or like do it through measurements on the ground.
Yeah, Simran asks, how can the general public intervene or help in regeneration of common lands?
By one, ensuring that you're not planting trees in common lands, or if you see a CSR effort or some local organization promoting the planting of trees in barren lands or wastelands, speak out against it. And 2, it's volunteer to help with an organization that is helping in regeneration of grasslands in common areas. Reach out to us as well. We are happy to put you in touch, or tell you how to help locally.
Yeah, before we go ahead, I just wanted to check with Arjun. Yeah, there are still some 47 questions. So do we go through it all, or what do you think?
I think I'm going to put that question back to Abi in terms of how much time Abi might have, right? And the other thing we can also do is club a few questions or send the questions to you on mail if you can answer.
Yeah.
And we can also do something like that. We can share an email ID so people can reach out directly as well.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are some common threads to some of these questions. There's some questions about there are questions about invasive species. So in removing invasive species is very challenging. We've seen this in the Banni. We have done this ourselves there. There's also not just the actual physical cost of removing prosopis, but also a social cost to it, because the people themselves are now so dependent on prosopis for charcoal making and as part of their livelihood, or for fuel wood, that there is a barrier to removal. So all of those need to be taken into account there. And basically, you need to find out, if you're doing anything, you need to find out who is it that's going to benefit from this, and who is it going to cost to do an intervention. So where is the money going to come from? Now the government spends a lot of money on a lot of things. So if you can convince them that including grassland restoration as part of their natural resource management is a good thing to do, then a lot of the fodder mission plots, like fodder development programs by the animal husbandry department, for instance, instead of promoting high yielding irrigated fodder varieties such as Napier grass, you could instead say, let's regenerate all these thousands of hectares of commons lands with native species of grasses which are drought tolerant and which are more climate resilient, and at more or less the same cost, and that also benefits free range grazing rather than stall fed. So a lot of government policies also need to change, and so a whole bunch of things need to come together. So we've got many things, many different directions to work on, but making sure that people who benefit from it get the right kind of incentive structures, their livelihood. So, for example, livestock production from open ecosystems needs to be valued correctly. You can't value it as if it's just normal agriculture. Just like you pay a premium for organic food, you should also be able to pay a premium for climate resilient food, yeah, so sustainable food. So those kinds of things that needs to come.
So Abhi, how would you like to take how many more questions? Yeah, do you have some time?
Gosh, it'll take me hours to go through all of this. So I'm happy to answer questions that have really not been answered by email. So my email is avanak@atri.org. You can look it up at the ATRI website or write to Arjun or any of the ERA folks, and they'll share it with you as well. So I'm happy to answer them offline. Arjun, you can share the director.cpd@atri.org email.
Sure. Yeah, I'll
Then
follow.
go to I'll get a whole bunch of people sitting and answering some of these questions as well.
Done. I'll make sure to do that. Yeah. Aditya, over to you then. Back.
Yeah. So thanks, Abhi, and thanks everybody for your questions and your engagement. And yeah, if you have any more questions about the ERA or the policy desk, you can write to us at director.cpd@atri.org, and hopefully we can take it from there. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.